Hola. Estic molt content que m'hagin convidat amb això del pensament. Amb això que faré ara, vull dir primer que jo penso una mica a la manera de Jordà Bru, o Giordano Bruno, que també li deien, que la llibertat és una cosa que funciona a tres nivells, diguem. La llibertat còsmica de l'univers o de Déu o de la matèria o de la natura, digue-li com vulguis, allò que diu Brossa en tres línies, el fons del fons del fons de la creació, la vida encén la vida. I l'essència és llibertat. El que fa la vida és crear constantment individus individuals, diferents, un darrere l'altre, infinits, tots els que han sigut, tots els que som i tots els que seran. I després hi ha un altre nivell de la llibertat, que és la consciència, la intel·ligència, el sentiment, l'ànima, la vida espiritual de tots. I, en fi, el tercer nivell, que és aquí, en què la llibertat es defineix com el fet de no estar tancat a la presó. I aclarit això, ara faré una cosa que vaig començar a escriure quan em vaig tancar 3 mesos amb ma mare, que té 97 anys, i allà hi havia un llibre de novel·lis, fragments, titulat bilingüe en alemany i català, i el vaig obrir a l'atzar, i deia: Jedes Wort ist ein Wort der Beschwörung, welcher Geist ruft, ein solcher erscheint. I vaig pensar, som-hi. I vaig agafar aquesta llibreta que a la portada havia posat A pes de braços, que és el títol. La frase alemanya, pel que no l'hagi entès, diu: cada mot és un mot del conjur. Crida tal esperit i aquest apareix. M'he de mirar quin esperit, perquè aparegui, vull convocar. Fer-lo venir és molt senzill. Només fa falta saber-ne el nom i dir-lo bé, i es fa present entre nosaltres com si ja hi fos. Quin triaré d'esperit, doncs, per fer que vingui? I he de pensar. I no m'és gens fàcil, perquè no sé com era pensar quelcom. Sé que no vull cap ni cap fórmula abstracta. Penso en algú, com de company, amb el seu punt d'extravagància, com un amic, que és un i molts, mils de caràcters en un de sol. Tots els seus nius i els camins seus són bondadosos i àcids a un temps. Per un trencant ja va arribant d'hereu escampa que ho paga tot. Pel carreró se sent baixar de germanastre plena d'humor. I pels camins venen veïns de rabifaires dels entreforcs. Tots aquests punts me'ls ha xerrat una cosina que és de pagès i diu cantant: qui vinguis viu i vivifiquis, essa hi està, però no sap a qui li diu que vivifiqui l'estar i el ser. Fa igual com jo. Tampoc no sé quina aventura també he engegat. T'hi veig els ulls, l'enteniment, la germania, l'aire salat, el gust de ser aquest país i aquell i l'altre, independents i lliurement dar-se les mans per ajudar-se tots amb tots. Nen, que t'ho redic, l'esperitet o esperitar-lo que hem de cridar no n'és cap ni cap capdill. No fa de guia ni fa de far. No té cap rol. Està escrit: tots els rols són gàbies a la paret de l'institut. I doncs, què fa? Fa de fantasma? Fa d'amulet? Encara menys. No fa de res. Fa companyia. Vet-li aquí. Mal que algun verb sembli futur, el present compte cau en present. I ara ja sí que ja la veig. La fantasmassa meva insurgent. I no en diré ara aquí fort el nom en públic, per si de cas, que de moment, amb un motiu com patufeta o patufet, ja anirem fent. El nom real, després, quan pugis al campanar, ja el cridaràs. O bé a peu dret, a dalt d'un marge, de cara al món. Però, perdó, un angelet que ens acompanya, què coi vol dir? Vol dir que el sol fet de saber que tal persona corre per aquí fa canviar molt finament no l'estat d'ànim, les actituds. Diu Nadrover, s'esfondra el temps, res no canvia. Potser té raó, però amb el poc de canvi aquest que just matisa l'actitud, no abaixarem pas l'altre plat de la balança, la tombarem. L'engegarem a pasturar amb els seus tristos pesots pesats. I de primer ni es notarà que res canviï. El canvi intern triga que un moment o dos abans no te n'adones tu amb tu mateix, però en el fons ja ho notes ja que la passola ja no fa el pes i els seus platets s'han embolat i orbiten lliures. I tu i jo igual. No estem clavats a cap presó. Planeta i barri se'ns han obert. No cal furgar contenidors d'escombraries per trobar pa. Fa cadascú ben bé el que vol. Cadascú deixa ser l'altre i fer. No pot forçar ningú a haver de viure així o aixà. I a part, no es pot. La llibertat és impossible d'eliminar perquè rebull el moll de dins de lo més íntim del teu cervell. Ella és l'alè vital, la font que fa que rutlli el ser tu. Fins i tot si tu ja no ho ets. Tu i casa teva no és. Que ser i anar lliure et pot dur fins al guapíssim estat de quan no hi ha res teu i per tant pots agafar, prendre i fer servir. Que s'ha acabat el remenar la merda que altres vulguin llançar per si hi hagués un tall de tall. Aquesta història ja ha durat prou. Tothom dinar pot amb tothom. Diu, vine a taula, agafa got i plat i seu. I ara aquí ve el clam d'en Roure de som-hi que n'hi ha per tots i en sobrarà, que és la divisa número 1. I mentrestant, una que ha estat com capficada, ara alça el cap, mira al voltant, s'aixeca, es treu de la butxaca el ganivet i obre el meló. I obre el meló i en va tallant tot de tallades i reparteix. I va dient: pren tu aquest tros i que no hi hagi més dictadors ni aquí ni enlloc. I tu el teu i que sense normes tot giri fi i sense lleis, tot de veritat. I té tu aquesta perquè estiguem bé pel camí. I a tu per tal que viure lliure no faci por. Sempre n'ha fet, sempre en farà, interromp l'altre. Sí, però la por que dius És emoció, és la por guapa que fa l'amor, no frena, encén. I un altre abós per l'alegria d'haver-vos vist, que és dels millors goigs que conec. I aquesta, tasta-te-la tu, perquè avui, musa o musot, t'atusti dolçament la testa i enmig del gran mar, terra, cel, vegis que vas en una barca i endús l'arjau, mous el timó, fas navegar la fantasia, ella i el vent, ella i el temps que fa. No veig cap jerarquia superior, a part, esclar, de l'amistat. I ara sí, l'última tallada va a compartir entre aquests dos que tots s'ho miren a quatre mans. Que sapiguem que com que els més valents són sempre menys violents, els més cagats són els estats i els farem caure caminant a peu, vivint a peu, normal. I així els rics pleguin, esbalaïts de veure'ns tan determinats a tirar sense cap capità. I així venim amb el nadó a pes de braços, hola, piu-piu, i tot a peu. Ilia Mayer i jo.
Antecipação. Se houver vida humana, haverá antecipação. Quando prevemos o resultado de um gesto, nem sempre nos apercebemos da ambição implícita nesse ato. Estamos demasiado ocupados a considerar os elementos e a forma como se vão comportar. Nesses cálculos, esquecemos com frequência a imprevisibilidade do caos, que em maior ou menor quantidade é ele próprio um dos elementos sempre presentes em todos os instantes. Ainda assim, pensar é prever. E a partir do momento em que calculamos o que irá acontecer, começamos a imaginá-lo. Vemo-lo no interior das nossas ideias, convocamo-lo para o futuro dos nossos sentidos. Ao anteciparmos aquilo que virá, parece-nos que vivemos o futuro no presente. e, no entanto, estamos sempre no presente. Talvez o futuro que antecipamos não se chegue a concretizar, mas sofremos a idealização das suas dificuldades. Desfrutamos da idealização das suas alegrias. A antecipação é a sombra de um objeto que poderá existir ou não. No entanto, a própria antecipação existe, inequivocamente. Transportámo-la connosco. Assim como o nosso corpo tem uma forma e o nosso rosto tem uma forma, assim como temos o nariz grande ou pequeno, também a antecipação que concebemos possui uma forma. Faríamos ideias muito diferentes uns dos outros se pudéssemos ver com clareza as antecipações que cada um constrói. Talvez haja gente distinta que faz antecipações banais. Talvez haja gente rude que faz antecipações sofisticadas. Talvez haja muitas surpresas na dimensão invisível que todas as pessoas contêm. Em qualquer dos casos, no futuro, continuará a existir antecipação. Agora, prever aquilo que iremos prever parece fora das nossas capacidades. Há muita distância entre estar aqui, olharmos em volta, fazermos constatações objetivas e a possibilidade remota de estarmos no futuro a prever o futuro desse futuro, especulação de uma especulação. Mas antecipar é o que fazemos em todos os momentos. Essa forma de olhar o tempo é uma das nossas características essenciais, marca a nossa identidade e a nossa presença de modo tão forte. Por isso, parece certo que no futuro continuaremos a imaginar. A nitidez da visão que antecipamos será tanto mais clara quanto maior for a nossa confiança no mundo. Quando acreditamos que conhecemos os outros, convencemo-nos que entendemos cada detalhe do seu comportamento. Damo-los por adquiridos. Achamos que sabemos a forma como sentem, como pensam. Conseguimos antecipar todas as suas reações e, no entanto, quando jogamos com eles aquele jogo de escolher par ou ímpar com os dedos, perdemos repetidamente. Estamos aqui e, ao mesmo tempo, estamos na antecipação do que acontecerá nos próximos 10 minutos, na próxima hora, até ao fim deste dia, desta semana, deste mês. Estamos aqui e, ao mesmo tempo, carregamos imagens com definição variável acerca do tempo que virá. Essas imagens referem-se ao futuro, mas a sua única realidade é o presente. A impressão que causam acontece toda neste preciso instante. Podem ter um efeito no futuro que criarmos, é verdade, mas elas próprias não são o futuro. A antecipação é uma curiosa matemática do tempo. Avaliamos o presente, encontramos-lhe possibilidades de evolução, adicionamos-lhe o que sabemos do passado, o que aprendemos e queremos funcionar, e chegamos assim ao que acreditamos ser o futuro. Como todas as formas de matemática, esses são cálculos cheios de imperfeições, e ainda assim permitem-nos o pessimismo e o otimismo, o desânimo e o ânimo. Se estivermos vivos e formos humanos, haverá antecipação. Para além do mundo que existirá diante dos nossos olhos, levaremos o mundo inteiro por detrás dos nossos olhos. Acreditar que continuaremos a ter esperança é em si um sinal de esperança.
Bona nit. Uns quants poemes de Margaret Atwood que llegiré en la traducció de Montserrat Abelló. Començo amb el poema dissenyadors de ciutats del llibre Joc en cercle, de 1966. Dissenyadors de ciutats. Creuant aquests carrers residencials de diumenge sota la llum del sol d'agost, el que ens ofèn és l'asèpsia. Les cases en rectes fileres pedants, els arbres plantats higiènicament, testimonis de l'ordre d'aquest indret, com un rebuig a la porta abonyegada del nostre cotxe. No hi ha crits aquí, ni trencadissa de vidres, res de més abrupte que el gemegar normal d'una segadora elèctrica tallant una franja recta sobre la gespa abatuda. Però encara que els camins d'entrada polidament esquiven la histèria, lliures d'irregularitats, i totes les teulades tenen el mateix pendent contra el cel ardent, algunes coses. L'olor d'oli vessat, una lleu pudor encara present als garatges, una taca de pintura sobre els rajols, sorprenent com un hematoma, una mànega de plàstic retorçada, provocativa, fins i tot la mirada massa fixa dels grans finestrals, donen accés momentani al paisatge que hi ha darrere o sota les futures esquerdes del guix, quan les cases capgirades caiguin lliscant obliquament en el mar de fang, a poc, com glaceres que ara mateix ningú no veu. Aquí és on els dissenyadors de ciutats, amb el rostre embogit de conspiradors polítics, s'escampen per territoris no cartografiats, amagats els uns als altres, cadascú dins la seva boira privada. Imaginant camins, tracen línies transitòries, rígides com llistons de fusta sobre una paret, en l'aire blanc i fonedís, dibuixant el pànic del barri residencial sobre la blanca frenesia de la neu. Els dietaris de Susanna Moody, de 1970, agricultors. Es mouen entre el límit irregular del bosc i la llera irregular del riu sobre un tros de terra desbrollada. El meu marit, un veí i un altre home netegen de males herbes uns quants bancals de mongeteres i patates polsoses. S'ajupen i s'alcen. El sol els il·lumina la cara i les mans, candeles que pampalluguegen el vent contra la terra opaca. Els veig. Sé que cap d'ells accepta que és aquí. Reneguen de la terra que trepitgen, fan veure que aquest terreny polsós és el seu futur. I tenen raó. Si abandonen aquesta il·lusió, per ells sòlida com un càvec, si obren els ulls tan sols un moment cap a aquests arbres, cap a aquest sol diferent, es veuran encerclats, colpejats, envaïts per branques, arrels, circells, pel costat fosc de la llum, com ho estic jo. De Procediments per a sota terra, de 1970, La petita cabana. La casa que vam construir a poc, des del terra cap amunt quan érem joves. 3 habitacions, les parets, arbres vius. Cremada l'any passat, digueren. Jo no ho vaig veure, i així la casa per mi encara hi és, entre les branques, com sempre. Jo estic dreta a dins, mirant com avança la pluja sobre el llac. Però quan torni a l'espai buit dins del bosc, la casa s'encendrà i s'ensorrarà de sobte dins del meu cap. Es plegarà com un tros de cartró llançat en una foguera, tot d'estius crepitant els meus antics jos perfilats entre les flames. Dins el meu cap quedarà la terra socavada, la veritat. On se'n va anar la casa? On se'n van les paraules quan les hem dites? Un poema de política del poder, que és un poemari de 1971 que s'enceta amb els versos que diuen «Dins meu tu encaixes com un garfi en un ull». Sec a la vora del llit imparcial, és devingut de vidre. Tu entres duent amor en forma d'una capsa de cartró, buida, una bossa, buida, algunes mans, també buides. Vés amb compte, et dic, però com pots fer-ho? La buidor et surt de les mans, omple lentament la cambra. És una pressió, una falta de pressió. Com una criatura del fons del mar amb ossos de vidre i ulls atreta a la superfície. M'obro i em trenco. Els trossos de mi brillen breument dins les teves mans buides. i 2 poemes del poemari Ets feliç, de 1974. El primer, la Cançó del porc. Això és en el que em vas convertir. Un vegetal gris rosat amb ulls de llimac, natges encarnades que s'escampen com un nap lent, una pell que emboteixes per poder-te alimentar quan et toqui, una berruga fètida de carn, un gran tubercle de sang que mastega i s'infla. Molt bé, doncs. Mentrestant, tinc el cel, que només està engaviat a mitges. Tinc els meus racons d'herbes, em mantinc ocupat, canto la meva cançó d'arrels i morros, la meva cançó de fems. Madame, la cançó t'ofèn, aquests grunys que trobes opressivament sexuals, confonent la simple golosia amb la luxúria. Soc teu. Si em dones porqueria per menjar, cantaré una cançó de porqueria. Això també és un himne. I d'aquest mateix llibre, Cançó dels cucs. Hem estat sota terra massa temps, hem fet la nostra feina, som molts i un, recordem quan érem humans. Hem viscut entre arrels i pedres, hem cantat, però ningú no ens ha escoltat. Sortim a l'aire lliure de nit només per estimar, cosa que repugna la sola de les botes, la seva estricta religió de cuir. Sabem com és una bota vista des de sota. Coneixem la filosofia de les botes, la seva metafísica de puntades de peu i escales. Tenim por de les botes, però menyspreem el peu que les necessita. Aviat ho envairem tot com mala herba, però lentament. Les plantes captives es rebel·laran amb nosaltres, les reixes cauran, les parets de maó es desfaran i s'ensorraran, ja no hi haurà més botes. Mentrestant, mengem brutícia i dormim. Esperem sota els vostres peus. Quan direm a l'atac, d'antuvi, vosaltres no sentireu res. Gràcies.
Hola, bona tarda, bon vespre ja. Quin gust sentir la Maria Cabrera recitant. Ja l'esteu veient? Sí? Hi, Margaret.
Hi.
It's good evening for us, but I think it's good morning for you.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, okay. So we're closer than I thought. If you just give me 2 minutes, I will talk to the audience, but I promise I will be short. Thank you. Com deia, quin gust sentir la Maria Cabrera. Ella ha recitat uns poemes que podeu trobar a l'Alè Misteriós, editat per edicions de 1984. És una de les seves obres de poesia, és un recull de diferents obres. També Llaunar Montaner ha publicat poemes de la Margaret Atwood. Gràcies a aquestes 2 editorials som aquí, també gràcies, evidentment, a Salamandra, a Quaderns Crema, també al grup 62, a l'Ambaixada del Canadà. Moltíssimes gràcies per facilitar-nos aquesta connexió, aquesta possibilitat de poder parlar una estona amb la Margaret Atwood. Dir-vos que la setmana que ve comença el Serializados Fest, que potser alguns veníeu perquè s'acostumava a fer aquí al CCCB i aquest any, malauradament, com tantes coses, s'haurà de fer a través de Filmin i de YouTube. I si sou aquí us agradarà saber que hi projectaran un documental que es diu Margaret Atwood, A Word After a Word After a Word is Power, i que el podreu veure entre el 20 i el 29 d'octubre. Començo ara a conversar amb la Margaret Atwood, però que sapigueu que al final reservarem uns minuts perquè pugueu fer preguntes. Poden ser en català, en castellà, en anglès, com vulgueu. Només us demano que les tingueu com molt ben elaborades, que siguin el més directes possible, perquè si són més curtes, entre cometes, podrem fer-ne més. Sé que el temps és molt curt, però és el que tenim amb ella. Així que moltíssimes gràcies per ser aquí. I'm done, Margaret. Thank you. How are you doing? Are you still in lockdown?
Yes, more or less, because I'm old. So, you know, we have to, yes, and also we have an upward trend here. We locked down earlier. We opened up a bit too much, and now we're seeing it going up again. So we have to be very careful. So I'm being very careful.
And how is it going? You look
Being
great.
Oh, thank you. It's going well. We keep in our family group, and we go for walks. We do a lot of Zoom calls, like this one.
Thank you for doing these ones too.
So lovely to see you, and what a pleasure to hear the poet reading.
Could you hear it?
It sounded wonderful, and I'm so sad that I can't be there with you in person, because I have such lovely memories of being in Barcelona, and I hope to be there again.
We'll be waiting for you. I suppose you can hear the applause. So, Margaret, here at the CCCB, we've gathered together, and we will be talking about the future for a few days. And so it was so convenient to have you here to talk about that. But I have to say that I'm quite afraid of the depiction of the future in your works.
Yes, you're supposed to be afraid.
Great.
So that we don't actually do those things. So we do not want a totalitarian government in the United States, and it looks as if we might not get one, or an authoritarian one. We don't want that either. That would be very bad news for the world. Nor do we want a world that is in which the planet is so threatened, as in the Mad Adam trilogy. So we want to avoid dictatorships, and we want to avoid the destruction of the biosphere within which we live. Otherwise, we can kiss goodbye to ourselves as a species.
So this means a book like The Handmaid's Tale. Do I have to see it as a warning?
Of course. It's not a blueprint. So the author is not saying, you ought to do this. The author is saying, maybe you might not wish to do this. But this kind of world in The Handmaid's Tale is very specifically United States, because it's based on a Puritan totalitarianism or authoritarianism of the 17th century. So different countries evolved different kinds of authoritarian governments in times of stress. And the one in The Handmaid's Tale is fairly specifically Puritan-based. I don't think that's a problem you have there. You'll have some other kind of dictatorship.
Yeah, we have other problems.
Yes.
Yeah, we could write a book on that also. But what made you write the book? The book was published in 1985. What made you write it in? I think it was in 1984.
And 5.
And 5. Okay.
Finished it in 5. So let me take you back in history.
Please.
Back.
Okay.
So in the 1970s, we had second wave feminism. Because before that, in the 50s, we had a very organized attempt to put women back into the house, make them stay there. And then we saw the 60s, in which a couple of things happened, and one of them was the advent of birth control for everyone. Then we had hippies. You probably won't remember hippies. You might not remember mini skirts.
Yeah, I do. Well, I don't remember them, but I know them.
No, you can't possibly.
Did you wear them?
Not of the late 60s. You weren't born. So then we had, almost at the same time, we had the coming into public view of second wave feminism, which was working on things like the rights of women to have their own bank accounts, the right to have equal pay for equal work. I don't think that's been achieved yet, but it was one of the things people were concerned about then, and a lot of other issues in the 70s, and some success for that. In the 80s, there was a pushback, specifically in the United States. They did not ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. Ronald Reagan came to power, and the religious right started to gain political power. And the government that you see now in the United States is a result of that. So that began in the 80s, and that's when I began writing The Handmaid's Tale, which I started in West Berlin, because the other thing that was still true in the 80s was that the Cold War was not over. It was still going on. So there was still the Berlin Wall, there were still the satellite Soviet countries, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Poland, Hungary, all of those countries. And nobody in 1985 saw that ending anytime soon. It was a surprise in '89 and almost a mistake on the part of East Germany, but all of a sudden, boom. And in the 90s, people were saying silly things like, it's the end of history. The idea being capitalism had triumphed. All we had to do now was go shopping. Mm-hmm. And that ended in 2001. Apparently, history was not over. But at the time I was writing it, we were still in the middle of one of the big totalitarianisms of the 20th century. So the big ones were Hitler, Mussolini, Mao, Stalin, and dare I say, Franco. Maybe I dare not say it, but it's true. Gave us some interesting 1930s architecture. And so we were still in the middle of that. And at that time, the United States was seen as the beacon of freedom and democracy, the free world, all of those things. So a lot of people in Europe did not believe that the United States would ever take a turn towards authoritarianism. And people in the United States, some of them didn't believe it either. But never say never, because anything can happen anywhere given the circumstances. And that is what then happened.
Mm-hmm. And then came Trump.
And then came Trump, and in 3 weeks we will know whether it's Trump forever, because he does seem to feel that he's immortal.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing. And he accuses his opponents of being against God. I guess that would be him.
I think he truly believes he is immortal.
Yes, well, never show a sign of weakness by admitting you might die someday.
There is something that made me laugh when I read it. With your irony, you said that you are the only living beneficiary of Donald Trump.
I'm afraid it's true. Because first we had the election, then we had the television series, which launched in April of 2017. And because he had won the election, people were not saying, oh, what a fantasy, that could never happen. Instead, they were saying, oh, no, could this be the future? And therefore, the television show was not treated as a never land. It was not treated as just an imaginary thing. It was treated as practically a reality show.
I think that you have a rule that also applies for the TV series, is that you never write something that in some way has already happened?
That hasn't already happened.
Yeah.
Yes, so it has to have been done somewhere at some time, and unless the TV show researchers can show that somebody did this, whatever it is, somewhere, sometime, it can't go into the show. And it was the same for the book. So I collected the research materials in case anybody ever said, you certainly have a very bizarre imagination. Nobody would ever do this. Unfortunately, in novels, reality is, if anything, toned down because it's worse in real life.
I found horrifying thinking that so many of those things had already happened. And you go back in history and there are things that seem like far, far away, but there are some things that are not that far away.
Not far away at all. And in our present time, a number of those kinds of things are going on in our present time. So this is not about left or right. It's not about the past to the present. It's about human behavior and how people are likely to act under diminished circumstances. So as a rule, these kinds of governments don't get in unless there's some chaos and fear. So chaos and fear, people feeling desperate. Along comes Mr. Strongman and says, I'll fix this for you. Just do as I say, it'll be fine. That's what they usually say at the beginning.
Fear is the biggest driver?
Fear,
it's for everybody.
Fear and chaos. Fear, chaos, and lack of material resources. So the French Revolution started when France had spent too much money helping out of the American Revolution because they were annoyed with England. And then they upped the taxes on the peasants, which were already too high. And then it was a bad harvest, and then there were food shortages, and the price of bread went up. That's when the revolution happened. When times are moderately good, people don't have revolutions of either the left or the right. You have to have bad times, and you have to have chaos, like nobody has a plan, or it appears that there's not a plan. So along comes somebody, look at my plan. Just do as I say.
You said before in the 90s there were people who thought history was over, which made you laugh.
Yeah. Wasn't true.
No, it wasn't. Big surprise. But for women, it's never over and it's never that good.
Well, it's been a lot worse.
Okay, thanks.
Yes. We're always in that position of is the glass half empty or is it half full? Or is it just a tenth full? To make you feel better, conditions improved for women having jobs right after the Black Death. Why was that? There were a lot of job shortages. There weren't enough men to fill these jobs because half of the population of Europe was dead.
Oh.
So for a while, women could have those jobs. It went then backwards, and it went backwards for women, guess what, after the French Revolution, because Jean-Jacques Rousseau said, one of the big 18th century authorities, much read by the revolutionaries, he said women belonged in the home. So all of these women who had fought in the revolution were then told, thanks, ladies, goodbye. Thanks for your help, now go home. And that has been a pattern throughout. So there's that to be considered as well. However, thinking back over history, 100 years ago, you and I would not be having this conversation.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, there was no internet, but also 100 years ago would take us to the early 20th century, and we just maybe I'll say 150 years ago. There were some female journalists 100 years ago, and there were some women writers, but in general they were regarded as quite freakish.
Mm-hmm. Okay, the second part of your answer is more comforting than the first one.
Yes,
I'll keep that one.
Yes, I like to be hopeful.
Are you hopeful?
Of course, I'm hopeful, because why bother not being hopeful? Mm-hmm. So I'm hopeful about the American election. Don't count them out. I'm hopeful about certain gains that have been made for women. I support an organization called Equality Now, and they work on laws having to do with women in different countries. And women have indeed made some gains, and women are very important in the environmental movement, or let me not even call it the environmental movement, let me call it the movement to save our species on this planet. Yeah, because if the oceans die, so will we. So women have been putting a lot of energy into that. They understand that equation very well. And I'm hopeful about that too, and I'm hopeful about the young generation. People under 20 have discovered new forms of organizing, new forms of working together, and they're putting a lot of energy into saving the biosphere and also into equal rights.
Mm-hmm. You're fighting for that also, for the oceans, but you don't like to be called an activist?
I'm not a real activist. I'm just a person who doesn't have a job. And
who doesn't have that job?
Well, no, I don't have a job, and that means nobody can fire me. And a lot of people who do have jobs have to be a lot more careful about what they say and do, because they will get fired. They will be considered too active. So people who don't have jobs like me, self-employed artists of all kinds, are frequently asked to be spokespeople because we can. So it is a privilege, but I'm not a real activist, because real activists devote their entire lives to the thing that they're fighting for. So let us say I'm a weekend activist. In real life, I'm a writer.
But we started this conversation talking about the future. If we want to keep talking about the future, the first thing to do, or one of the first things to do, is to save the oceans.
Yes. In fact, unless you save the ocean, everything else you're talking about will be irrelevant, because you won't be breathing. And the reason you won't be breathing is that the oceans make 60 to 80% of the oxygen that we breathe, as they did 1.9 billion years ago, when our atmosphere changed from a methane atmosphere to an oxygen atmosphere. So that's just simple biology, and check it out. But the truth is, if the oceans die, if they stop producing oxygen, you're going to have a lot of trouble breathing. First of all, you'll get very stupid, and then you'll have a lot of car accidents.
It's good to know that you're hopeful with that. And you said that you're hopeful also with the American election.
Yes. It's like everyone on this side of the Atlantic Ocean, I check the polls every day.
Do you?
And I do, yes. It's kind of a neurotic obsession. I don't live in the United States, but as we say over here, if Washington has a cold, Ottawa sneezes. So they are our biggest trading partner, they are very large. They're 10 times bigger than we are, and everything they do affects us. So, of course, we watch them very carefully. I don't know why, but they don't watch us with the same degree of obsession. How do you explain that?
I think you've been trying to be seen for years.
Well,
You did a
no,
lot for
it's
Canada.
sometimes it's better not to be seen. So when giants are stomping around, maybe it's better to hide under a stone.
Mm-hmm. What made you write the Testaments?
Well, you already know the answer to that because we've had the background.
Maybe there's someone
Yes,
who doesn't.
yes. So the Testaments is the sequel to The Handmaid's Tale. And for years and years, I said I would never write a sequel. And then I changed my mind, as people tend to do when conditions changed.
But
so
it took you 35 years, which is great.
Yes. Instead of moving away from The Handmaid's Tale, we appeared to be moving towards The Handmaid's Tale. So I'm interested in how totalitarianisms begin, but I'm also interested in how they end. And there are many different ways in which they can end. And therefore, I thought we knew that the Handmaid's Tale world did end, because at the end of the Handmaid's Tale, we're 250 years into the future, and they're having an academic symposium about it. So we know it ended, we're not told how. So I thought I would explore a little bit how that might have begun to end. And I've been interested for many years in individuals within a regime who decide that they differ from the regime that they are in, what they might do about that.
And I think you're very interested also in the truth, if I can say it like with the capital letter.
Yes, I'm interested in the truth. It's a very annoying characteristic to have. Because then people start saying, what is the truth? Well, there are some things that are opinions, and there are other things that are facts. So if it's a fact, I want to know if it's true or not. Because you can't really have an opinion about it unless you know whether the thing that you're having an opinion about is true. We are seeing an age in which politicians of various kinds have attempted to conceal, distort, and confuse simple matters of fact. For instance, facts about COVID, just for an example. Mm-hmm. And that's important because people's lives depend on knowing what the truth is. Mm-hmm. So I don't think it's not negligible.
No.
To want to know what the truth actually is.
Mm-hmm. I didn't ask you before. Did the COVID inspire you in some way?
Not yet.
Not yet?
No, but I think it's probably inspiring a lot of young people because they are the ones whose lives are going to be really, this is going to make a big impression on them. And particularly kids who are in their teenage years or at university, this has really messed up their life very suddenly. So things changed very suddenly for them. And something is going to come out of it. Some of these people will grow up, they will become writers, they will become artists, and this will have made a deep impression on them.
At the beginning today, as you could hear her, Maria Cabrera was reciting some of your poems. I think that the first time that you decided, I think it was a decision, quite a quick decision, that you would become a writer. It was after writing a poem.
Yes, it was, but it was quite a bad poem. I was 16, but of course, so you had to think they're good. You must think that your poems are good when you're 16. So yes, I did decide that. And of course, I knew nothing about what it would mean. I knew nothing about writers' lives. I knew nothing about publishers. I knew nothing about agents. We didn't have any agents in our country. So I made that decision in total ignorance. Would I have done it had I really known? I'm not sure. The main thing in those days was, well, how are you going to make a living?
Mm-hmm.
You know. So I just thought, well, I'll have other jobs, and I did have other jobs. I had quite a lot of other jobs, some of them quite strange. But nonetheless, that was what I wanted to do because it was more interesting to me than anything else that I was doing.
Because I think that when you had to choose a job or what to study, jobs were more for boys, and then girls were to be more prepared to be those boys' wives.
That was the deal in the 1950s, but I paid no attention to it.
Good.
Yeah, so you had 5 possible jobs in the early 50s, and they were public school teacher, nurse, not doctor, secretary, home economist. Don't know whether you have such a thing.
No.
And airline stewardess.
They all seem fascinating.
That's it. And I didn't actually want to be any of them, but it was the 50s, and it was a time in North America of quite full employment. So you weren't worried about not having a job. You were just worried about what kind of job you might have. So that's the proposition that I went ahead on. And at first I was going to write true romance novels.
Did you?
Well, I tried. The only reason I was going to do that was that I looked up what kind of books made the most money.
Oh.
and that was the kind. So I was going to write those in the daytime, and then I was going to write my works of deathless masterpiece in the evenings. But I could not write a true romance novel. It was beyond me. I think you have to actually believe in it, and I'm sorry to say that I didn't. So then I decided, well, then I'll be a journalist. So my parents, who by all this time were probably quite worried, because who wants their child to be a writer? It's not very secure. They had a real journalist to dinner who was a second or third cousin of ours. And he said, well, if you want to be a journalist, you'll just end up writing them the obituaries and the ladies' pages, said he in 1957, which was probably true then. So then I thought, well, I'm not going to be a journalist, so I guess I'll have to go to university and, teach or something. So that's what I did. But then I wanted to run away to France, live in Paris in a garret, smoke gitane, drink absinthe. I wasn't good at either of those things. Write deathless masterpieces and be a waitress, and then get tuberculosis and die a tragic but beautiful early death.
Okay. I'm glad you didn't do that.
It didn't happen.
Lucky you.
Well,
I think you wanted to write, and you wanted to write on your high school book. I don't know if you call it like that.
Yes, my high school yearbook, yes.
Yeah, your
yes,
high school yearbook.
yeah.
I think it said that you wanted to write the great Canadian novel.
Yes, well, that was kind of a joke, but I wrote all those things in the yearbook, not only for myself, but for the other students.
Okay.
So that's a sample of my early writing. Yes, me and my boyfriend at the time wrote them.
But in fact, you decided that you'd be a writer, and it went quite well.
Not for years.
Not for years?
Not for years. No. The people have this idea that, the first book they write, they'll get this huge amount of money for it. It doesn't happen. So the first book I wrote never got published.
Okay.
Hooray. It wasn't very good. So I'm happy about that now. But I wasn't at the time. And I would say I didn't become a person with no job until 1973. So I spent the 60s having jobs or being a student, one or the other.
I think you thought that you'd never be a popular writer.
Well, it wasn't something that happened in Canada in the 60s. You thought you would be a literary writer and that you would have a small but discerning audience of other writers. That's what you thought.
But you did win a real important prize with one of your first poetry books.
I did. What a surprise that was. Yes, I was 27. I had to go to Ottawa to do the prize ceremony, and I didn't have any proper dress to wear. So I borrowed a dress from my roommate because I was living with two other people at that time. So I borrowed a dress from her and went off to this ceremony. And while I was away, my two roommates burnt my my regular shoes because they felt that that they were too shabby for a person of my newly found exalted stature.
I think you also bought like new lenses.
I did, yes. So I got a bit of money with this prize, and I bought two things. I bought an electric typewriter. Hooray. Yeah. We don't have those anymore, but they were wonderful at the time. And I bought some contact lenses, but they had not yet invented the soft kind of contact lenses. So I stuck them in my eyes, and they were quite hard. And they were the kind that would fall out into your mashed potatoes. And if you got a speck in your eye, it was very painful. So I hadn't practiced with them very much. And I went off to the ceremony, and there was a dinner, and I was seated between two nice gentlemen. And I started crying because of the lenses. But they thought I was overcome with emotion. They started patting me and saying, "Never mind, it will be all right. Of course, you must be very emotional." And I thought, I'm not emotional. It just... Yeah, so I ran into the washroom and took them out.
Well, since you've never stopped writing poetry, and I would like to ask you how is it for you? I think music in poems is really important.
Well, it's a theory that I have, but you can never test it. And my theory is that if you wired up a poet, if you wired up their brain, and if you wired up a novelist, you would find that novelists take part in a different area of the brain. So novelists are using something more like ordinary social discourse, and poets are using something closer to music. But you can't test it because you cannot tell when a poet might be writing a poem, unfortunately. I would like to know that, but I probably never will.
This is a truth we won't find.
Well, unless we get quite dictatorial with the poets, but they don't react well to that.
Yeah. Who does? And you used to recite poetry also, but I think that was a bit hard for you.
You're thinking of coffee houses at around 1960.
Yes.
So this is a thing that came out of the City Lights bookstore in San Francisco and then started spreading around like beatniks. So ours was called the Bohemian Embassy, And we did get letters from people who thought it was a real embassy and they wanted a visa, but it was not a real embassy. And it was in an exposed brickwork, disused warehouse, as it should be. And you went up a flight of creaky stairs, and then you would find the little tables with the checkered tablecloths on, and the Chianti bottle with the candle, the stand-up microphone, the espresso machine, first one in Toronto, worshipped like a god, and poetry night. There was a jazz night. There was a folk singing night. Folk singing was big at the time. And there was a poetry night, which I recall was on Tuesday, one of the least desirable days of the week. And the poets would get up and read their poems, and I did that too. And once you had done that, you were more or less immune to any other kind of mishap that might occur during public life, because the espresso machine would go off in the middle of your poem, or someone would go to the washroom and flush the toilet and open the door, which opened right onto the place where you were reading the poetry. So you just had to keep going.
And I think you got sick sometimes also.
Oh yes, I had a period of regular throwing up, but that was partly because I was drinking too much coffee.
Okay.
Yeah.
Then your first novel came, and I think you had the best presentation ever.
Oh, my first book signing.
Yeah,
yes, my
signing.
first official book signing.
Yeah.
You want to hear about my first official book signing,
I'd
which
love to.
took place in the men's sock and underwear department of the Hudson's Bay store in Edmonton, Alberta. And why was it there? I think it was there because it was near the escalator, and they must have thought, oh, all the people going up and down the escalator will see this nice young novelist sitting there with her book called The Edible Woman, and they will rush to buy them. That did not happen. What really happened was that I frightened a lot of men. So you could almost hear them running away in the opposite direction. How many copies did I sell?
How many?
Two. I thought, wow, this is the writing life. This is so great.
Yeah, and it changed.
Yes, it did change.
It's for the good. When you grew up, you had like different childhood, not only because it was in Canada and it would have been different, but because you spent a lot of time in the woods in the north of the country.
Did. Yes, it's true. Yeah, so if you look at a map of Canada, Canada's really big. There's even a song called Canada's Really Big. So it is quite enormous. And the part of it that I was in, you would have to look on a map and you would see Ontario, which is where I am now, and next to it you would see Quebec, and there's a river that goes up between them, and it's called the Ottawa River. So you go up the Ottawa River, and then you would go to the east into Quebec, to a region called Abitibi, which is quite remote. It was very remote then. In fact, it was so remote that my parents, when they first went there was no road. There was just a little narrow railway. And then you had to get to where we actually lived by boat. So I spent a lot of my childhood in canoes, motorboats, in the woods, what with the wolves, the moose, the beavers, the mink, the owls, and other forms of wildlife, and hardly any people.
And I think you didn't go to school until 7. I think you were 7.
Yeah, I didn't go to school for a full year until I was 12. I didn't go to school at all until I was 6, because there wasn't any school for young children at that time. And then we would be in the woods in spring, summer, and fall. But in the winters, we were always in a city, because my father was a scientist. He was a forest entomologist, and he studied outbreaks. So outbreaks are when one kind of insect eats a lot of trees. And then he would go back to the city in the winter and write up his results. So spring, summer, and fall, field biologist. In the winter, writing up the results.
And how was it like to go to school and meet other children? And I suppose, I don't know, maybe have the feeling that you were different.
Not at first. I don't think that kicks in until kids are, 8, 9, 10 or so. How was it? I was very bored because I had to sit in, this was the military style of school that was in the 40s. So you lined up. There was a girl's door, there was a boy's door. You lined up in rows. You marched in, march, and you sat down in desks in rows. So it was pretty organized, and I certainly wasn't used to that. I wasn't used to desks. And we did our schoolwork in the woods just by filling out the exercise books, and the faster you could do that, the sooner you could go outside. So I'd become quite speedy, and I already knew how to read, so school was kind of boring.
I think your mother made you read a lot of books because she was
No, she never made me do anything.
She just wanted to silence.
I wanted to read because nobody would read the comic books to me. So I learned to read so I could read the funny papers.
Because you were very fond of comic books, I think.
Very fond of them. They were the art form of children of our generation. There were a lot of them, beginning in about 1946. But even before that time, there were different ones. And they were the thing that was supposed to be bad for you. So parents would make speeches about how bad these comic books were. So, of course, we read them. And thing to do was to have a big collection of them and then trade them with other children if you had a chance to do that. But it was a very interesting time for comic books, and it was shortly to become even more interesting. In the McCarthy era, there was a comic called Pogo, which was actually quite political. So I became interested in them as a political form as well as an entertainment form. And I wrote my own, and drew. I wrote and drew my own series in the 70s.
Mm-hmm. And you wrote a novel about an ant?
When I was 7.
When you were 7?
Yes, I was 7, 6 or 7. So it was a good lesson in novel writing, because an ant doesn't do anything for 3/4 of its life. So for the first 3/4 of my novel, nothing happened. I don't recommend this to any novelist. Put an important event quite close to the beginning. But with the ant, first it was an egg, then it was a larva, then it was a pupa, and finally it got legs. But until it got some legs, it couldn't go anywhere.
Do you think that your childhood and I don't know, maybe your way of seeing things once in school, even if you were really bored, had something to do with you being a writer?
Oh, probably, but you never know these things because the childhoods of writers are very different from one another. So looking back, people make these inferences and connections. I think the kind of writer I am was influenced by that, but not necessarily the fact that I became a writer. So my brother, who was 3 years older, was a very good writer when he was young, but he became a scientist instead of a writer. And that could have happened to me. Our marks were the same in both subjects. He was as good at English as I was, and I was as good at biology as he was. But we took different paths. But that's not a matter of capability. I think it's a matter of desire, what it is that you wish to do.
When you said before that when you decided that you'd be a writer, you had no idea how it really worked for writers, what an agent did, for example, but you had like this idea of what a writer was. It's like writers, they have, or you have, like an acknowledged role?
Well, that's something that people are always exploring, but in Canada at that time, they were invisible. There were a few who might be somewhat known a bit, but in the 50s, there had been some in the 30s, for instance, but in the 50s, really not, because what happened in the 30s and 40s? We saw the rise of the paperback book industry in England and also in the United States, but there was no paperback book industry in Canada at that time. So the paperback books that were available were all from people who lived somewhere else. So from Britain, from America, but not from Canada. So you could get published in Canada, your book would appear, and then it would disappear. It had no continuing life. So in order to find out even about Canadian writers who had preceded us, we had to dig. It was like an archaeological dig, an excavation. We had to rediscover people. So there's a plus and a minus to that. The minus was, what do you mean you're going to be a writer? Nobody from here is a writer, like that. The plus was, there isn't any competition. And nothing against being a writer because you're female. It's just writer itself was not an acknowledged category. So those are the pluses and the minuses. But the upshot was we, of our generation in the 60s, we started publishing companies so that we would be able to publish our own work.
I read that your agent said that she saw you when you were writing The Handmaid's Tale, and you didn't seem to feel right, and you told her that you were suffering, but that you had to write that book. Do you think that there is something that you writers have to do, like for society or something? Like a duty? Or?
Yes, it's dangerous to start telling writers what they have to do. The individual writer may decide that, but if other people start dictating, then you're in a dictatorship. Are you not? So I think the individual writer follows their talent wherever it may lead them, but to start imposing conditions, yes, you can be a writer, but you have to write this. Somebody else saying that usually produces bad art. If it's from within, that's a different thing. So my feeling about The Handmaid's Tale was that it was a crazy book, and that people would think I was nuts. But on the other hand, if I didn't write that one, I wasn't going to be able to write anything else either, because that would block the path to anything else. I did try to write something else. I started The Handmaid's Tale. I went off and tried to write something else, but that didn't work. So the message was clear.
I suppose we have questions from the audience. I can see them very well. I'm going to take my glasses. Si teniu alguna pregunta, si podeu aixecar el braç. Just a second, Margaret, sorry. There is one question here.
It's a long question.
Yeah.
You told them short questions.
No l'estic sentint, perdona. Bueno, no l'està sentint ningú, de fet. It's something to do with the mic.
Can you hear me now? Yes. Okay.
Yes.
It's working now. Okay, thank you. Well, thank you very much for being here. It's really a pleasure to hear you speak. I was just wondering, when you were saying that you're passionate, or you're very into speaking the truth, then I was wondering, because as a young generation, from the young generation, we don't have now we don't trust a centralized medium for the truth.
Mm-hmm.
So it's more or less related to social networks now. So I was just wondering, what is your vision of a truth police in a way? And how could this be filtered?
So there's a difference between an opinion and a fact. So Napoleon did not win the Battle of Waterloo. And I think a lot of the kind of stuff that we hear on social media too, it's opinion presented as fact.
Yes.
And being the kind of boring, nosy person that I am, I like to excavate those kinds of things to find out what they are based on. The problem with social media is it's very rapid. Things happen very quickly. People make up their minds. And sometimes what they make up their minds about is an opinion, not a fact. So there's two questions to ask about anything that is presented to you. First of all, is it true? And second of all, is it fair? And if it isn't true, there's no way it can be fair.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Are there any other questions? Yes, there is one there. I don't know if they can see you. No sé si et poden veure. Hi ha un noi allà a l'esquerra.
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah. First of all, thank you for giving us a little bit of your time. I was wondering, because you basically grew up, at least the first years of your life, you grew up in a moment of complete chaos in the world. So I was wondering, how did you see future, or what was future for you, basically, and what could we extract from that moment, for example, for now?
Right. All right. So when I was born, it was November 1939. So that would be 2 months after the beginning of World War II. So I spent the first half of my childhood, from year 0 to year approx 6, in World War II, and then the aftermath, the fallout from that, we still had rationing and things like that, until, say, 1950. So it was wartime. It was austerity. A lot of things weren't there. You didn't have them. I remember my first coconut. It was a big event. Oranges were like gold. And you just didn't expect to have a lot of things. And also you were worried a lot of the time. So even though I was up in the woods, of course, grown-ups were around, and you could tell that the mood was somber. And in the winter, of course, we had the radio, and it would say, this is London calling North America. Here is the BBC News. And then you got some bad news. So it was daunting, and I've been fascinated in that period ever since. But it wasn't all negative, and there's some pretty inspiring stories that came out of it. It was also a time at which we had very few vaccines for diseases. So a lot of the diseases that seem to have practically vanished from sight were common in those years, and it was common to see quarantine signs on people's houses. And things like diphtheria were big child killers. 4 of my cousins died from diphtheria. Polio was a big killer. You were very afraid of it. So quarantines and having to be careful about where you go, that it's not a new thing for me, but for young people, it must be shocking because it has not happened within their own personal memories. It's like something long ago, like the 1919 influenza. So my words of hope to you are, we shall get out the other side of this. It will depend on getting a vaccine. It will depend on getting an insta-test, like scanning your ticket at a theater, yes or no, red or blue. We will know immediately who is infectious and who is not, and that will make a huge difference. So that will happen, Scout's honor, but it will be a matter of time. But I'm guessing April. It's my prediction.
Jo crec que ens queda temps encara per una pregunta. Si algú en té una, si podeu aixecar molt el braç, perdoneu, és que no us veig gaire bé. Bueno. Ningú té més preguntes? Sí, n'hi ha alguna allà? Perdoneu, és que tinc els focus i no veig res. Allà, gràcies per aixecar-te.
Voy a hacer la pregunta en castellano, por eso.
No se sent bé, perdona.
Haré la pregunta en castellano.
Claro.
Es Margaret, encantado de saludarte. Has colaborado en un proyecto donde un grupo de gente ha plantado un bosque que van a talar en 100, 200 años cuando haya crecido. Y entonces, con todo ese material, van a hacer libros que publicarán a diferentes escritores, entre los que has participado tú. Hasta entonces, las obras serán, no las podrá leer nadie. Quería preguntarte cómo es escribir para alguien del futuro y que no sabrás cómo va a reaccionar.
The project is called the Future Library of Norway. And the project is, a forest has been planted near Oslo that will grow for 100 years. And in each year of that 100 years, a different writer from around the world will submit a secret manuscript, only 2 copies. And you weren't allowed to tell anybody what's in that. And those will be held until 2114, at which point the manuscripts will all be opened and enough trees will be cut from the forest to print the Future Library of Norway anthology. And people got very interested in this project because it's hopeful. It says there will be people in 2114. There will be a library in Oslo in 2114. The trees will grow. People will still know how to read. People will still be interested in reading. How hopeful that is. So I was the first one. I added something to the project. I said, use archival paper. Because if you don't, they will open the box and there will just be these little crumbly bits of paper. So archival paper, 2 copies. I went over to Norway. I had my manuscripts in a box. I put a blue ribbon on it. And I was afraid that the customs people would say, what's in the box? And I would have to say, I'm not allowed to tell you. And then they would arrest me. But that didn't happen. So we walked into the forest with the Norwegians, and the mayor of Oslo made a speech. The chief librarian made a speech. The head forester made a speech. The originator of the project, name is Katie Patterson, a conceptual artist, made a speech. I made a speech and I handed over my box. And that library room has now been built. You can go into it. You can see the name of the author and the title of the book of each author who has contributed, and that's all you can see. So it's going to be a lot of pressure on the people in, say, the year 2100, because they will still be alive when their box is opened. But no pressure on me. And the only mandate was that whatever you put in that box has to be made of words. So it can be one word, it can be your laundry list, it can be a letter, it can be a novel, it can be a story, it can be a play, it can be an essay, as long as it's made of words. And no, I can't tell you what I put in.
But is it your laundry list?
It's not my laundry list.
Okay. Margaret, thank you so much. It was really great to have you here. We hope to have you back here in Barcelona in the near future, I hope. Thanks so much.
I would love to be there.
We'll be waiting for you. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Encara amb la Margaret Atwood, en la veu de la Maria Cabrera.
Què ha passat durant les pauses d'aquesta conversa? Que parla de llibertat personal i de política i de la necessitat de passió. Precisament això. Penso en aquella dona que no van matar, sinó que li van cosir la cara deixant-li la boca tancada amb el forat de la mida d'una palleta i la van tornar a deixar al carrer, un símbol mut. És igual on va passar això, per què o si ho va fer un bàndol o l'altre. Aquestes coses passen de seguida, que hi ha bàndols, i no sé si hi ha homes bons amb una vida endreçada gràcies a aquesta dona o malgrat ella. Però un poder així no és abstracte. No li preocupa la política ni la llibertat de les persones, va més enllà dels eslògans. I quan a la passió, n'és la més intricada negació. El ganivet que separa els amants de la teva carn com si fossin tumors i et deixa sense pits i sense nom, aplanada, sense sang, fins i tot amb la veu cauteritzada per l'excés de dolor. Un cos escorxat i espellat, fibra a fibra i penjat a la paret, un estendard agònic exhibit per la mateixa raó que ho són les banderes. Aquest era el poema Tortura del llibre Històries veritables de 1981 i ara llegeixo Llengües de la Maresma del llibre Matí a la casa cremada de 1995. Silencien les llengües suaus i fosques, llengua materna, llengua materna, llengua materna. Van caient una a una dins la lluna. Llengua de les maresmes, llengua de les arrels de jonc embullades dins del llot, cèl·lules entrellaçades dins l'escalfor del moll de l'os, camins de llum oculta dins els cossos s'esvaeixen i s'apaguen. Els sons sibilants i guturals, llenguatge de les cavernes, la mitja llum que es forma al fons de la gola, el vellut humit de la boca que modelava la síl·laba perduda per dir jo, que no volia dir separació. Totes s'estan convertint en sons que ja no se senten perquè ja no es diuen, i tot el que abans s'hi podia dir ha deixat d'existir. Les llengües dels sols moribunds també es moren, però fins i tot la paraula per dir-ho s'ha oblidat. La boca contra la pell, vívida i que s'esvaeix, ja no pot dir paraules ni d'estimació ni de comiat. Ara només és una boca, només pell. Ja no hi ha recança. La traducció no ha estat mai possible. En el seu lloc només hi ha hagut conquesta, l'influx de la llengua dels vocables durs, la llengua de metall, la llengua de les disjuntives, l'única llengua que s'ha menjat totes les altres. Del mateix llibre, el poema El moment. El moment en què, després de molts anys de treballar dur i d'un llarg viatge, et trobes al mig de la teva habitació, casa, mig acre, una milla quadrada, illa, país, sabent a la fi com hi has arribat i dius, això és meu. En aquell moment, els arbres deixen anar els seus braços flonjos que t'envoltaven, els ocells tornen a desar el seu llenguatge, els penyals s'esberlen i s'esfondren, l'aire s'aparta de tu com una onada i no pots respirar. No, xiu-xiuegen, no posseeixes res. Eres un visitant que de tant en tant pujaves a la muntanya i plantaves la bandera, proclamaves: nosaltres no et vam pertànyer mai, no ens vas trobar mai, sempre ha estat a l'inrevés. Del mateix llibre també Matí a la casa cremada. Esmorzo a la casa cremada. Sàpigues que no hi ha cap casa, no hi ha esmorzar. Tanmateix, sóc aquí. La cullera que es va fondre rasca el bol que també va quedar fos. No hi ha ningú més pels voltants. On han anat el germà i la germana, el pare i la mare? Enllà, per la costa, potser. La seva roba encara és als penjadors, els seus plats apilats a l'aigüera, que és al costat de la cuina de llenya amb la graella i la tetera fumada. Tots els detalls ben nítids, la tassa de llauna i el mirall boirós. Fa un dia lluminós i sense cants, el llac és blau, el bosc vigilant. A l'est, un banc de núvols creix silenciosament com un pa negre. Puc veure el senyal sobre l'hule, puc veure les falles en el vidre, aquella lluïssor on toca el sol. No em veig els braços ni les cames. No sé si això és una trampa o una benedicció, trobar-me un altre cop aquí, on tot en aquesta casa ja fa temps que va quedar enrere, tetera i mirall, cullera i bol, fins i tot el meu propi cos, fins i tot el cos que tenia llavors, fins i tot el cos que tinc ara. Mentre sec en aquesta taula, aquest matí, sola i feliç, peus nus d'infant damunt les fustes socarrades amb la meva roba en flames, els pantalons curts verds de tela fina i la samarreta groga tacada envoltant la meva carn cendrosa, inexistent, radiant, incandescent. I del poemari La porta, del 2007, el poema El secret. El secret flueix dins teu com una altra mena de sang. És com si te l'haguessis menjat, com un caramel dolent que t'has posat a la boca. Has deixat que se't fongués dolçament a la llengua i que després s'escolés gorja avall, com si pronunciessis marxa enrere una paraula dissolta en les seves guturals i sibilants, una lenta inhalació. I ara és dins teu, el secret. Antic i pervers, voluptuós com vellut fosc. Et floreix a dins, una rosella feta de tinta. No pots pensar en res més. Un cop el tens, en vols més. Quin poder que et dona. El poder de conèixer sense que et coneguin. El poder de la porta de pedra. El poder del vel de ferro. El poder de dits aixafats. El poder d'ossos ofegats que criden des del fons del pou. I per últim, del mateix poemari, el poema La porta. La porta s'obre, mires dins. Tot és fosc, segurament hi ha aranyes, res que vulguis per tu. Tens por, la porta es tanca. La lluna plena brilla, curulla de suc deliciós. Compres una bossa, el ball és agradable. La porta s'obre i es tanca tan de pressa que ni te n'adones. El sol surt, esmorzes de pressa amb el teu marit, que encara està prim. Rentes els plats, estimes les teves criatures, llegeixes un llibre, vas al cinema. Plou amb moderació. La porta s'obre, mires dins. Per què continua passant això encara? Que potser hi ha un secret. La porta es tanca. Cau la neu, neteges el camí tot esbufegant. No és tan fàcil com abans. De vegades els teus fills et telefonen. S'hauria d'arreglar la teulada. Et mantens ocupada. Arriba la primavera. La porta s'obre, tot és fosc allà dins, amb molts esglaons que baixen. Però què és això que brilla? És aigua? La porta es tanca. El gos s'ha mort. Això ja havia passat abans. En vau tenir un altre, però no pas aquesta vegada. On és el teu marit? Has deixat de cuidar el jardí. Se't va fer massa feixuc. A la nit hi ha flaçades. Tanmateix no pots dormir. La porta s'obre. Oh, Déu de les frontisses, Déu dels llargs viatges, has estat lleial. És fosc allà dins. Et confies a la por. I entres. La porta es tanca. Bona nit, gràcies.